Welcome to Slash Forward. Don't you just hate it when someone tries to pull your dang head off? But what if it was necessary, in terms of completing a ritual to the benefit of a group of occultist psychos looking to summon the eighth god of hell for their own personal enrichment? How would you approach this, and what would it feel like as an outsider with no understanding of what's at stake? We are going to explore this and dive into the details of Hereditary right now. Let's get to it. We open on a fairly standard obituary for Ellen Lee, and then step back slowly from a little treehouse as peeking in on us like one of them perverts. This is seen from the most whimsical craft room where the world's most cursed dioramas are made. One of them we zoom in on and transition seamlessly to a bedroom where a miniature man, Peter, is roused for the day's memorial service. Stephen then goes to retrieve Charlie, hoping to bring them all together as Annie waits patiently in the car. She has a tall task today, conveying a feeling of warmth and comfort to all the strangers at her mother's funeral. Other than Charlie, who was Grandma's favorite, she was a remarkably difficult and private woman. As a result, she's earned only a lukewarm sentiment. They get home and spend their evening making sure they don't eat nuts, tucking in for bed, and building their lives in miniature. Charlie expresses concern now that her grandmother is passed. If mom goes as well, who will care for her? Annie emphasizes the crushing loneliness she might face to see if she can get her to cry, for no other reason than to demonstrate that she is capable of feeling something. Before lights out, Annie cracks open one of the boxes of Ellen's leftover goodies. She finds a book of pagan rituals that contains an uncharacteristically encouraging note. It's not much, but it is enough to elicit a faded vision of her mother. The next day at school, Charlie is encouraged to focus on her work. But how can you when birds are dive-bombing into oblivion? And then the alluring call of the scissors' well-honed edge. Peter also suffers from distractions like dem cakes, and also the promise of smoking a bowl with his homies. For her break activity, Charlie finds the bird and stares at it for a while before revealing her scissory intent. But this is not a solitary action. She is being playfully watched from across the street and betwixt the bars. That night, Annie finishes up making her minis and finds her mom's room open, inexplicably, as Stephen had absolutely nothing to do with it. Probably just a draft or a church mouse, but they lock it up tight regardless. Then Stephen gets an unexpected call from the funeral home to inform him that Ellen's gravesite has been desecrated. Due to the precarious nature of Annie's mental state, he holds that close to the chest. She then leaves for a movie, which ends up being code for partaking in the personal and shameful drama of grieving over a lost loved one. She finds out at the end that since it's her first visit, she has to speak. No tourists allowed. Basically, she didn't think much of the old bird. Ellen was manipulative, vindictive, and surrounded by schizophrenia and psychosis. Annie took her in when she had to, but tried to keep her compartmentalized. She allowed her to slither back in when Charlie was born, and is now afraid of being blamed for the subsequent damage that likely caused. Meanwhile, back at the house, Peter tokes up and organizes his social calendar as someone unseen tokes back. The next day, we visit with Charlie, who's back at it building her toys and getting distracted by a blob of light, like she always does. She wanders out to meet the light. Elsewhere, Annie's under pressure to turn in some progress pics for her work. It's due relatively soon, and she's about 20% done with it. Peter hopes to leverage her distraction for permission to borrow the car. For nothing major, just a school barbecue. You know, like the kids are into nowadays. But no dice. She wants him to take Charlie along, not understanding that he's trying to get faded. Speaking of Charlie, she's out in the woods observing a flaming crone when Annie comes upon her and can't help but scold her for being shoeless and preferring Grandma over her. She tries to balance this out a bit by forcing her to go socialize at this school event. And she is good company, and also adds her own special ambiance. The school barbecue turns out to be fairly high energy, indoors, not very rustic, and absolutely riddled with nuts. But Peter's locked onto his target and tries to pull up with a fancy seeing you here, which doesn't get him very far, so he brandishes a sharing-sized bag of weed. The next step is convincing Charlie that this is a party, so the cake is for everyone and she should busy herself with the task of eating it. He's very disappointed to find that this is a group smoke sesh, but he does his best to fit in with the cool crowd, as we all do. But out on the dance floor, Charlie is showing signs of having consumed an allergen. She alerts Peter and tries to describe what it feels like to die, so he whisks her away to seek out urgent medical care. He floors it as her throat becomes thick and she fights to consume as much oxygen as possible. Her technique, however, does not pair well with the sudden appearance of a deer carcass, resulting in Peter sitting by the road hoping that if he wishes hard enough, things might be okay. But for fear that if he looks, he will make it real, he instead cruises home at a moderate speed and goes inside. He settles into bed and just sort of zones out all night long, until the wailing of his mother confirms this nightmare to be his life. They have a funeral and memorial service, after which they all try to cope in their own ways. Peter stays in bed, partially comatose, Stephen peruses Charlie's doodles, and Annie tries to stay warm and cozy in the hideaway. Things don't get better as Peter is constantly taunted by the rearview mirror. He tries to self-medicate with the boys under the bleachers. They carry on as though life is real and normal, but it is not, and he demonstrates this with a spontaneous, sympathetic panic reaction. He slowly, eventually makes his way into the house, and then Annie drives off. She thinks better of sharing her grief this evening, but there's always one of those pushy oversharers in every group, and in this one, it's Joan. Joan's got one of those faces, so Annie, despite herself, begins unloading all of her troubles. Joan has had similar experiences and also a grief side hustle, so she gives Annie her card before she jets off to return some videotapes. When she gets home, Annie does her best to get to sleep, but remains inconsolable. The best option for her is the treehouse. The red light burns into Peter's retinas, and he is haunted by a faint but familiar tongue click and the silhouette of his clothes on a chair. The next day, Annie digs into some detail work as her paid job falls behind. Then a chance spilling of her pigments brings sweet Joan back to her attention. After using a reverse phone search, she finds Joan's apartment with a cross-stitched welcome pad just like her mama used to make. You know it was meant to be. Inside, over some tea, Annie recounts the horrible story of the grim discovery of her daughter's headless torso. After a short lithium break and a moment to remove some of the tea grit from her mouth, she then discusses her tumultuous relationship with Peter. Once when he was younger, she had a sleepwalking episode that found her waking up in their room after dousing them all in paint thinner and holding a book of matches. So their status is somewhere on the spectrum between strained and shattered. At home, Steve is talking about SAT prep as if that's on anyone's radar. Get a grip, Dad. And Annie has decided to try to mend her bond with her son by constructing minis that recreate pivotal moments in his life, starting with the most recent. What? It's a totally neutral presentation. I'm gonna just say that later on they have an awkward family dinner, because it may be too much of a stretch to say they're enjoying it. Peter, noticing a brief hesitation in Annie's face, cracks open the conversational door.
Is there something on your mind?
And what's inside her mind is a heaping helping of resentment and anger. The release is somewhat cathartic for her, but then finally emboldened to lay blame. The tautological nature of personal responsibility results in finger-pointing every which way with no resolution. The next day, Annie's ongoing quest to maintain productivity finds her at the art store where she happens upon Joan. Joan is absolutely beside herself about a recent unspecified transformative event.
And I feel completely turned around.
Ah, an ayahuasca retreat.
An open seance.
Oh, she swears that even the skeptics got turned out, and she even commissioned a private seance in which she heard her sweet grandson's voice. She confidently invites her right over, apparently having seen enough to pull this off on her own. It seems like a good idea. We see that she's on that Ouija board shit as she calls out to young Louis, and Annie finds this 4D PhilharMagic experience a bit overwhelming. Joan lets her go so she can have some private time with Louis, but sends her away with an instructional pamphlet and the encouragement that she can't be responsible for Charlie's death if she's not actually gone. But when presented with Pandora's box, do you or don't you? Or what if it's already done? That night, as she continues to not sleep, she finds some night visitors tracing a line on her pillow. They originate from the window and are some juicy little buggers. And she follows the path which leads her all the way to Peter's corpse. But when Peter sounds the alarm, she learns she was just snoozing. And in this foggy state of mind, she suffers a bout of candid truthfulness.
I never wanted to be your mother.
This affirms him constantly feeling as though she wishes him dead, which she claims was totally a thing of the past, for sure. But the paint thinner episode kinda lingers over things, you know? Still unable to sleep, we hear her mumbling some Latin, the devil's language, in order to set the stage. Then she rouses the boys and gathers them downstairs. Due to the fantastical nature of her claims, she begs them to just humor her for a moment so they can see with their own eyes. They barely have a chance to start concentrating before she's calling out to the Netherrealm. When the Netherrealm hollers back, Stephen tries to tap out, but the door is now open and soon Annie is manifesting.
Why are you scaring me?
Which causes everyone great distress. This escalates until Steve takes drastic measures. Unfortunately, this does not have as much of a healing effect as one might hope. This is driven home when Peter is mocked at school by flashes of light, a reflection that won't cooperate, and another tongue click. Stephen's primary objective at this point is protecting Peter. Annie becomes indignant about the implications here, which is not the proper mindset for creating tiny things. When the gallery calls to offer a postponement of the exhibit, she decides to take them up on the offer to the extreme. The boys return to an unusual smell in the house and the discovery of Annie's afternoon activities. The rift now formed results in Stephen having a little camp out that evening, and he doses up under the stars, like he does when he's camping. Upstairs, Annie hears a scratching noise and is relieved to find that it's not a rodent. It's just Ghost Rider filling up a sketch pad with clues. Peter wakes up to an apparition of Charlie in the corner, and her head rolls off in a playful way. They also have a surprise dog, and then someone starts trying to pull his dome clean off. He wakes up wondering why his mom is tugging on his noggin, but she claims she just got there because of the screaming. She then intensely proclaims that while she's not sure what's happening, she's the only one who can fix this, and that she will fix this. Meanwhile, the sketchpad is working on some portents of anguish for Peter. This is Annie's starting point, and she attempts to end the demonic scribbling with fire. But she seems to get a little ember on her sweater because her arm tries to light the way. It seems to be in some way connected to the fate of the book, so now she knows to never wear her evil sweater again. The next morning, Peter comes out ready to meet the day, and Annie comes out urgently needing to meet the Joan. But pound as she might, Joan will just not answer, and we see inside that she's got some sort of ritual thing going on in there with Peter's eyes. It's not clear exactly what it's for, but it sure does prevent your boy from enjoying his milk, risking stunted growth and brittle bones. Then he hears a noise clearly in his head that is unnervingly coming from Joan quite a ways away.
Get out!
But since he's outside, it's an utterly confusing situation. At home, Annie begins scouring her mom's things looking for clues. It appears she was a fan of astrology and also may have made a hobby of conjuring the god king Paimon. And depending on how you view things, the misogynist or misandrist who pulls this off will be rewarded untold riches. She then finds ample evidence that Joan was a close personal friend of her mother's, who was also a close personal friend of Paimon. So, through the transitive property, Joan is Paimon. Or something. Circling around, we find Peter still following random reflections off of people's phones, and that Stephen gets additional evidence regarding the grave desecration that looks like a full-on abduction. Back at home, Annie has decided to check the attic. When she drops the ladder, she's greeted with indications of major decomp going down. She goes up and does find the cause of the smell. There's only one candle lit to offset the rancid corpse. You really need an odor neutralizer for this kind of situation. At school, Peter hears another tongue click, then raises his hand for a question, but he can't get it out because someone's trying to pull his darn head off once again. Luckily, it stops due to its own failure because everyone is too freaked out to get close to him. The school's call goes unanswered at home because Annie is self-soothing in the clubhouse, so Steve has his midday work drink interrupted, and he is pissed as he drives his sleepy boy home where they put him straight to bed. Annie then urgently tries to convince Steve of what she saw in the attic. Now, you might be afraid that everything's going to be gone and Annie will appear insane, but he is greeted by a full family of flies. Now the problem is that, despite the details she fills in for him, he has a totally different interpretation of her mysterious absences from the house and whatnot. She tries to convince him to allow her one last extravagance before calling the police. The book must be destroyed so she can be sacrificed to save Peter, but despite her culpability, she doesn't have the strength to do it herself. Unfortunately for Stephen, this is where he draws the line. Right here and no further. Completely unwilling to humor her, Annie has a surge of courage and does it herself, but with a moderately different effect than expected. Peter wakes up that evening to a quiet house and a throbbing face. Mommy keeps an eye on him as he ventures out into the dark. following the buzzing of flies and strange otherworldly bangings that occasionally pierce the silence. When he gets downstairs, the chairs are all askew. He is greeted by his father's charred corpse, and Annie is in the rafters again. He observes a friendly fellow in the doorway, and he is chased into the attic where the lack of ladder now poses no problem for Mother. When the banging stops, he recognizes the unlikely nature of this situation and attempts to wake himself. His efforts are interrupted by some juicy noises overhead, and he looks up to find his mother in her favorite spot, very aggressively committing herself to a crash diet. Even with all that, it ends up being the elder nudity that sends him straight out the window. He lays here for a moment as his friendly guiding light enters him. Then she wakes up and sees her mother floating by and follows her up into the treehouse where the worshippers are waiting. The place has really been set up nicely for them. An off-screen voice welcomes Payman into his new body, apologizes he had to spend some time in that lowly female skin suit, and suggests that, now that he's come inside this strapping young lad, they will patiently await their riches of wisdom, wealth, and dominion over the will of man after he gets adjusted. What a rich and satisfying world we've entered here. To try to summarize this for clarity, Annie's mom Ellen was an occultist. She was the leader of a small group of people who worshipped the demon Payman. He was one of the 9 king demons of hell. Conjuring him into the material world would result in tremendous riches for the conjurers. Oh, and if he could, his preference is to occupy a male body. This was the driving force in Ellen's life. She seemed to have friends and a strong social net, but in regards to her own family, she was a crazy bitch. Annie grew up resenting her, but felt obligated to take her in when she became infirm. She had a no-contact policy in the house, but eventually relented when Charlie was born. Once Ellen was allowed to get her claws on Charlie, she manipulated her into preferring Grandma over Mother, and leveraged her to conjure Payman. However, this initial conjuring wasn't fully actualized. I would assume there was far less ritual involved than what we saw at the end, because Charlie was female, which Payman doesn't prefer. I believe there was also brief indicators that something might have happened to Ellen's husband in regards to an unnatural death. So we're potentially looking at Payman into Old Man, then into Charlie, then into Peter as a final, fully realized form. This central drive for Ellen also greatly influenced Annie's life. She harbored significant resentment against her mother, which impacted her own views on motherhood. She was not happy about being pregnant the first time and confessed that, deep down, she never wanted Peter. This likely stemmed from her own strained relationship with her mother, and from the poor impression of mothership she had due to her own terrible childhood. She mentioned feeling forced to do this, possibly by duty as a wife, but likely egged on by Ellen regardless of the seminal reason. Outside of that, we were following along from the family's perspective, and the family was being manipulated by outside forces. As a result, we never got a full view of what was going on in terms of the stages of ritual. When were certain powers being imparted and for what reason? The significance of some of the iconography, the staging, etc. It's safe to assume that the prior rituals were intended to be half measures, because they obviously didn't involve anything like the level of commitment we saw in the final. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had any characters left. Another natural implication of these efforts is that most of the events that unfolded involving Ellen would have been orchestrated by her. For instance, needing to be taken in may have actually been a ruse to stay close and bide time until she could get a sacrificial vessel. It's hard to question much about this movie after a single viewing. So much of what was presented was clearly intentional, and there were callbacks and little connected details all over the place. Plus, some things are left to the imagination for the purpose of generating terror, which is perfectly fine. As I said before, it was told from the family's perspective and they had no idea what was going on. Annie wanted to try to fix things, but she was, for the most part, just kind of winging it. She was making what seemed like reasonable assumptions based on the information available to her and the experiences she had had up to that point. It was startling to discover they had a dog. I only caught indication of its presence at 3 points in the film, one of which involved its carcass. It's not clear to me what the significance of that was, outside of emphasizing how confused and limited the family's understanding of the situation would have been. It may be more time efficient to discuss what wasn't good about this movie. Honestly though, I don't think there's much to complain about after one viewing. Things tend to hit different once you're more familiar with the material. This movie will make you feel things and take you for an emotional ride. Afterward, I did have a creeping little seed of dissatisfaction related to the ending. Everything was so crazy that it almost felt like a letdown to have it end as a normal demon possession. But it's all just impressions and feelings right now that likely require more time and experience with the story to verbalize, so take that with a grain of salt. I will say that, broadly speaking, this is an excellent example of taking a known format and presenting it in a unique way that continually surprises the viewer. The film uses demon possession and exorcism as a dressing for its broader themes. But the themes are what drives it, the depictions of loss and grief, the feelings of guilt and resentment, and the concern that these are passed on between generations despite our best efforts or intentions. These are shared concerns we can all relate to. And in the universe of this movie, they were specifically generated by the pursuit of possession and Ellen's obsession with the occult. It all ties back together and creates a tremendous framework for the story. The execution was also excellent. This really felt like a true representation of how this scenario would play out. In terms of the confusion and horror, normal demon possession movies would involve some action that initiates the demon. Then the demon slowly begins to ramp up its efforts to scare the potential victim. Then the victim seeks out and immediately finds that one person who can provide them information on what's happening and what to do. And then there's tension between the protagonists trying to do what they need to do while being resisted by the dark forces in whatever form they take. This story did not follow that sequence at all. I think a good contrasting example that emphasizes how not to do this would be The Innkeepers. The Innkeepers tells a ghost story but attempts to present it in a unique way that sidesteps the typical tropes. It has some good spooks in it but really failed to capitalize on anything. There was no real driving force behind the story, the parts that were intended to be subtle were nearly invisible, and it generally falls flat in comparison. This comes as a highly recommended movie. It's good all around and on its own merits. The only real detrimental factor would be if you genuinely do not like being scared or unsettled by a movie. This one has legitimate visual and auditory scares, but also is deeply unsettling on an emotional level. But when you're in the mood to have your feelings manipulated, this film will give you what you need. Now that we're here, I wanted to congratulate you for making it to the end of the video and affirm that you are a very special person because of it. Before we go, I'd like to give a huge thanks to my donors, memorialized in the Hall of Headshots. I have a website set up where you can support the channel through donations or merch. Any donation unlocks a growing collection of uncensored movie recaps. And if you enjoyed the video, I would love for you to become a part of the channel by subscribing. Thanks for watching.